that was an old way of tricking people. You can do that on iPhones, where you can go into the accessibility settings.
Just flash it up.
Well, because it's like it's a feature. It's a nice feature for accessibility, where like you can make it, if you just put AA, it would put like a different word in, and so I can go in and make the something else.
Really?
Yeah,
And then you just
like
mess
make
it
your
up with
name something else, and so like you type
I
your
wonder
name.
if my
it's
ex
like,
did it. Well, he wasn't my ex at the time. I wonder if that was when, because I was like, I just couldn't understand. Like, what is that? Why? Maybe someone messed
It's
with
like a
me.
classic troll technique. I'll bring it up for this panel.
No, please don't. This is told to you in confidence. You know, I have a lot I can say that you told me I'm not allowed to say. So just, you know, just be careful what you do.
Mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, exactly. 20 people. I was hoping we'd have some
Project Veritas is here?
newsroom readers. Oh, I hope so. I'm sure that they came all the way just for us.
Well, they've been
Oh, they're really into you?
busy. No, not me. God
Mm,
forbid.
it's not.
I'm not important.
You want me to go? Okay. Hello. Oops. Too close. Hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started. Welcome. It's very good to have you all here. My name is Victoria Vilk. I'm the Program Director for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America. We are a nonprofit that celebrates and defends the written word in the US and internationally. We've been advocating for a free press for about 100 years. And we have been working on online abuse now for almost 5 years. We really see it as a direct and pressing threat to free expression. And when I talk about online abuse, I'm talking about tactics like death threats, rape threats, publishing of people's home addresses, impersonating people online, non-consensual intimate imagery. And these are tactics that are used by governments, political movements, corporate actors, organized crime, and a lot of other powerful groups to attempt to intimidate and silence reporters and undermine the entire sort of profession of journalism. So it's an issue that we take very seriously, and the focus of today's session is actually going to be what can newsrooms do, what can newsrooms and publishers do to better protect and support reporters and other staff who are facing online abuse because of the work that they're doing. And I do want to give a couple quick thanks. First of all, I want to thank the International Journalism Festival for having us do this session. It's my first time here, and it's been a wonderful conference so far. And also to thank Craig Newmark, who has been supporting this work years and years, I think, before many other people realized quite what a big problem this would become. And so we're very grateful for all of that support and for the support he offers to the Coalition Against Online Violence. I am incredibly honored to be here with some pretty spectacular people. We have Jason Reich, who is the, wait, you just told me the title, the new title, Vice President of Safety and Security at the New York Times. Pascal Doucet-Bon, who is the Deputy Director of News for France Télévisions. Elodie Vial, who is the journalist and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and also collaborates very often with me at PEN America. And Karen Mahabir, the Director of News Talent for Development at the Associated Press. So some pretty stellar people. And I want to start actually relatively simply. I just want to ask each of you, and we'll kind of go down the line, to talk a little bit about what your experiences have been with online abuse, either as witnesses, allies, or folks who were directly on the receiving end of some of these tactics. And so I think I'll just ask that you keep your answers short, but I'll start with Jason.
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Victoria. I'm lucky that I have never been a target, but in my role at the New York Times, I work with many of our journalists who experience frequent and daily abuse, including abuse that translates into, unfortunately, real-world violence. In a number of instances, it is a topic that I had been working on for many years. In fact, Victoria and I had met when I was working earlier at BuzzFeed, where I really launched a lot of the early initiatives to help focus that organization on online abuse, and I'm bringing a lot of that same material over to the Times. And I think at this point in 2022, it's a little bit, thankfully, it's a more accepted topic in a lot of newsrooms, but that certainly wasn't the case 2, 3, 4 years ago. So it's great to see folks here who are interested in learning about this, and I'm happy that this panel is happening.
Pascal?
Well, as an executive in the news department in France Télévisions, I have to confess that in 2018 we didn't have any strategy, any protocol against online harassment, and we began to have some cases at this time. And I looked for solutions and ideas everywhere. And then I met you, Victoria, in 2019 to get ideas, and from there we began to build something against that.
Thank you, Pascal. Elodie?
Yes, so a few years ago I was the head of the tech desk at Reporters Without Borders in Paris, and at that time a lot of journalists reached out to us because they received death threats, intimidation. In every country, I mean, even in the north of Europe, with countries like Finland at the top of the World Freedom of the Press Index, journalists were increasingly attacked online. And so I started monitoring the situation, writing a report, online harassment when trolls of journalists, when trolls attacks, monitoring the situation worldwide, but I was still looking for solutions to support these journalists. So, of course, I discovered PEN America's resources in this field and did this work, studied engaging with the platforms and policymakers and academics to find out solutions as a fellow at the University of Michigan, and then as a consultant for PEN America and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center. So there's a lot to do in this field, research programs, and I do a lot of trainings too for journalists worldwide.
Thank you, Elodie. And Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Mahabir, and I'm, as Victoria said, the Director of News Talent for Staff Development at the Associated Press, but up until about 2 months ago, I was the AP's fact check and misinformation editor, a position I held for about 5 years. And it was during that time that I witnessed a lot of direct attacks on my fact checkers, a lot of my staff, a lot of whom were young women and people of color. And I have been the target myself for the first time, actually, just recently. So I do have a lot of experience in seeing a lot of the direct threats, and that's what compelled me to want to get involved in this work. And I am a founder of the AP's Online Harassment Committee, where I'm working to develop a program to better protect our journalists.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. So, Pascal, I want to start with you. And can you sort of talk to us a little bit about how online abuse actually undermines a reporter's ability to do their work?
For 2 years, we have had an average rate of a case every 10 days in the group France Télévisions, 2,500 journalists. So I don't have any official metric, of course, but from my experience, I can say that in 1 case on 3, the journalists decide not to write anymore about the topic for which he or she has been harassed. So that's why it's not only a question of health in working, it's also a question of democracy and freedom of speech, of course.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think that's a big part of what is so jarring about this is it's very much a tactic that a lot of folks in power have realized is an incredibly effective way to shut journalists up, or to try to, right? Or to try to force them to write about other things or change the way that they're writing, which a lot of times doesn't work. But the point is it's a kind of cumulative chilling effect across the industry. Does anybody else want to add anything else to that in terms of the kind of impact on a reporter's ability to do their job?
I would say it does work. It does work, unfortunately. And we work very hard to make sure that reporters feel safe and that they can cover difficult topics. But even with a very robust safety network in place, it introduces the potential for unconscious biases, unconscious fears, and that can be reflected in the work as well. It just adds a lot of extra challenge and friction in the reporting process, which, you know, as Pascal says, is really interfering with our work.
Jason, actually, I was going to ask you to talk a little bit more about because the way that I met you initially actually was that you're an expert in physical safety, and so that was not my expertise, and so I would often call or text or ask Jason a lot of questions about that. So can you talk a little bit about the ways in which digital safety, physical safety, psychological well-being are all sort of intertwined?
Sure, and even since we had first started working together, my views on this have changed a lot, and the industry's views have changed a fair amount. At this point, it's clear that there are real risks to someone's psychological well-being from repeated, consistent attacks online, even if it's clear that those attacks aren't necessarily going to translate into offline harm or offline violence. And so, for example, there's many cases where the security team that we have at the Times or security teams at other organizations would respond to an episode, and somebody would say, okay, I know that they're not going to hurt me, but that doesn't make this okay, and I still have serious concerns. And of course, when that's spread out over time, it really begins to have an impact on their well-being. And the last thing I'll say to it, which is really unfortunate, and it was came up in a panel we were at yesterday, where journalists who are experiencing this begin to fear, they begin to grow paranoid, and it begins to interfere with their personal lives, and they begin to see things even that aren't there necessarily, and that can actually have an effect that compounds on itself as well. So it's really, it's quite serious, and it's something that's not strictly in the domain of, well, how do I protect you from someone attacking you or being hurt on the street? It's, I think, a little more complex than that.
Did anybody else want to add anything about the kind of tie between physical safety and digital safety?
Yeah, I can add there. I mean, I think, at the Associated Press, the person who is handling our physical safety is also handling our online harassment at the moment, because there is so much overlap in the way that we approach both of those issues. And I think I liken it to, if you're preparing somebody to go out into a potentially dangerous situation for coverage, so you have to arm yourself as well for that sort of blowback on online harassment in that world. And so it's about how do you find the resources and the tools to protect yourself, and then what actions do you take, and is there a process in place in your newsroom to escalate that properly? And those two situations, the online and the offline, are very similar in that for us.
And I want to add an anecdote that we had talked about in our prior conversations, that when I had actually started working, my first time working in a newsroom in 2013, 2014, my experience was working with reporters who are working in conflict zones. And so when I started working in this newsroom, a lot of my focus was on, when is the next person going to go to Syria or Afghanistan or whatnot? And that's going to be where I need to focus a lot of my effort and attention. And what I found was I was actually, even back then, mostly dealing with issues of online harassment. And it was, and years later, some of those journalists, the conflict reporters who had been to these areas, would then, move to a different assignment and then say to me, sure, dodging bullets or violence in a war zone is stressful, but it's a particular kind of stress. It's an acute stress. But the online harassment is affecting me as well, and it's affecting me in a different way, and it's really important. And it's very validating, and I hope it's, it's validating for folks who've experienced it here to know that reporters that are working in war zones, they too find this to be a serious issue, and they're the ones who say, oh yeah, this really gets to me in a way that's actually different from being in an open, kinetic conflict.
Thank you, Jason. I think one of the things I'm curious to hear from you folks about is whether you feel in the last 5 or 10 years the attitude in the newsroom industry around this issue has changed. Like, has there been a change in awareness, acknowledgement, et cetera? And I don't know, we can start with anyone. Elodie, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know you've done, like me, you've done a lot of training over the years. You've seen some of this stuff.
A decade ago, I would say that online abuse was not a topic. We trained journalists to make the most of digital tools, and we told them to be on social media, so maybe that was not a good advice. And yeah, when I started working on online abuse 5 years ago, it was not even a topic, I would say. Like when I reach out to people to do interviews, even editors-in-chief, so even journalists facing the situation, they say, no, that's not a topic, you know, but now at least I feel that everyone acknowledged that this is a topic. It doesn't mean that things have changed for the better. Of course, we have New York Times, France Television, and AP with good practice, but I feel that there's still a lot to do within the newsrooms. And the first thing I would say is to acknowledge that there is a situation which is not a personal situation, that the journalist is targeted because they're a journalist, even if the trolls, the toxic trolls, just use personal information. And we're still, in many countries, in the process of advocating the newsrooms so that they can acknowledge this. So yes, we have a better situation, protocols, but there's still a lot to do.
Yeah, and did anyone else want to jump in? I mean, I have many thoughts on this, but does anyone else want to say anything?
Yeah, I can if you like.
Please, just turn your mic.
Yes, it is. In 2018, the word online harassment in France was only used to deal with dramas involving teenagers at schools, etc. Never journalists. And at this time, we considered controversy, even when it's unhealthy, as job as usual. And it wasn't, we were wrong. And it took time. It took time for us to admit that it was not just controversy. And now we began to acknowledge, as you said, and to build protocols.
And I'm doing for 4.5 years now a great deal of work with individual institutions and kind of across the industry, and I've seen changes. I mean, I think that I think a lot of us, when we started doing this work, by necessity focused on self-defense, because the situation was so acute for so many people, and nobody in J school trains you, in journalism school trains you how to deal with this stuff. I don't know if anyone here has had any training in journalism school to deal with this, but mostly it doesn't happen. And so we were sort of in that sort of self-defense, like, what do you do? How can I help you if you're dealing with this? But when you focus only on self-defense, you're not acknowledging that it's a systemic problem, and a systemic problem requires systemic solutions. So I think part of why we really want to talk about what institutions can do is because institutions can help relieve some of the burden that is constantly falling on the shoulders of folks who receive the most abuse in their media organizations, so that it isn't getting so much in the way of their ability to do their job, which is what they actually want to be doing instead of reading horrifying tweets all day and worrying about death threats. I have a kind of follow-up question, though. There's an American writer, Ed Zitron, wrote quite recently. He was writing about this issue, and he was sort of saying, I'm going to read because I don't want to misquote him, but he was saying that in the face of coordinated harassment campaigns, newsrooms need to actually clearly call out such campaigns as anti-democratic, anti-free press propaganda as a form of warfare. He was saying it's not enough just to say, no, this is a good journalist, they're not doing anything wrong, we have their back, or to offer them self-defense training, that newsrooms actually have to make a statement that acknowledges what these kinds of bad faith attacks are trying to do in order to push back kind of at scale or with power. So I guess I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that question.
I can jump in there. We did, I think it's really important to do that. And, just speaking from my own experience, we had a case, I think it was last August, in which the press secretary for the governor of Florida basically called on the governor's Twitter followers to go and target one of our reporters. And he subsequently received a lot of hate messaging and threats. And our incoming CEO at the time wrote to the governor's office and asked him to basically stop this harassing behavior. And we were very public about that. We wrote a story about it, and we even linked to the letter that our CEO had written in the story. And I think, it's not something that we have done very often, but I think it was a really strong move by the company to do that. And so I think there are times in which organizations do need to come out publicly and say, yes, we do stand behind our reporter, and we stand behind their reporting, and for the reporters in the newsroom to know that the company will do that.
Yeah, so that it feels less isolating, because it can feel profoundly isolating to be thinking that you are the only person experiencing this, because people haven't been talking about this for years and years. Reporters bore this stuff in silence, quietly, not telling each other, not telling their managers, or trying to tell their managers and then hearing that, oh, but it's not a big deal, just get a thicker skin, take a break, you know, et cetera. And so I think that this point of knowing that your institution has your back, that you're not alone, is hugely important. And Jason, I saw you were leaning towards you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I also want to zoom out and talk about not just one institution, but the industry at large. One of the factors around this online abuse that I think is different from what people might have called online abuse 20 years ago is if we can use maybe the example of an individual, a certain person. Let's take like two trolls, a troll from 1999 and a troll from 2022, or what we would call, you know, I think actually troll wouldn't be the right word. In 1999, if the New York Times or any newspaper were to publish a piece, something controversial, maybe, you know, the very close Bush-Gore election or something of that nature, there would be a ton of really angry messages that would come into the newsroom. But the character of the person sending that message, and this is an important distinction that hasn't, I think, been caught by a lot of news organizations. The character of the person sending that message, they might be angry, they might be using inappropriate language, they might have gone too far, but what they're actually trying to do is they're saying, we want you to be better. You know, our narrative, we want you to change or correct, but it's because we believe in journalism, we believe in your institution, and we think that you're doing it the wrong way. They're going about it maybe in a method that isn't appropriate. Maybe they're a little too hot under the collar, but they're a little too angry. But that's I don't even want to say necessarily get into good faith, bad faith, but it's a form of criticism that a news organization should at least address or confront. Nowadays, I think it's really important to understand that some of these attacks, not all, but some of these attacks are done not to make us better, but to destroy us. The intent is actually to damage these institutions because the forces that are behind these attacks need these institutions to be weakened, right? And there's a very different response mechanism when you're dealing with someone who's passionate and really believes something and just maybe has a different opinion than you do, and you do need to address that differently than an individual or a group that ultimately wants to see what you do destroyed. And I think that we need to clearly recognize, not all the time, but there are cases, and a lot of it is reflected in this online harassment, that there's actually groups that are just trying to break down what we're trying to do and not actually engage in productive or meaningful dialogue. And that's a new distinction that I don't think organizations have fully grasped yet.
Yeah, and I would actually add, I want to build on that a little bit. There's like another layer of kind of subtlety maybe there, which is that it's not only about trying to destroy independent journalistic institutions, but it's actually also about making them less diverse and less equitable. Because I think many of the institutions, many of the folks who face the most extreme forms of online abuse are women, as Karen said actually, are women, people of color, LGBTQ folks, members of religious and ethnic minorities. And it's those reporters in newsrooms who get it the very worst. And so I guess I want us to talk a little bit about how that intersects with the efforts that we're seeing in the industry, somewhat belated but important efforts to make institutions, newsrooms, more equitable and more inclusive. If anybody wants to tackle that question, but thanks, Karen.
Well, I think not at all. Well, I mean, I think to your point earlier that, you know, organizations need to show that they have their reporters back. I think it's extremely important for news organizations to have strong policies around online harassment and a strong social media policy. And I think when we think about attracting diverse talent, we need to be upfront and transparent and clear about that, and let them know that, and it's not just about bringing them into the company, but that we'll have their backs really throughout the course of their career, and that, you know, hopefully that when we're onboarding them, we can explain to them that we have this process in place should you face any sort of harassment. I think it's an extremely important part of attracting diverse talent.
Thank you, Karen. Anybody else want to jump in? Thoughts they want to offer? No? Okay. So I think what I really want to get into the nitty-gritty of, like, a lot of why sort of I wanted to see a panel like this at this conference is I want to talk like shop about what do you actually do as an institution. I have had so many institutions reach out to me over the years and say, we actually know this is a big problem. Like we see it all the time, every day. It really worries us. We want to help, but we don't entirely know where to start. And so part of the reason I invited all the folks here is because they have been trying all kinds of things and doing all kinds of things over the years, trial and error, you know. And so I would love to hear kind of actually everyone on here, and you can go in whatever order you want as the spirit moves you, to talk a little bit about like what within your own institution have you been trying and what's working and what's not working. And I hope that we can be a little bit forthright about like some of the things that have worked and some of the things that are sort of still, we're all still trying to figure out. Because there's a playbook, there's an authoritarian playbook, but I think we don't all yet have a playbook for how to counteract some of this kind of online, coordinated online harms. Who's first?
I'm happy to start. I think everybody should talk to Victoria. That's the first step. No.
I paid her to say that. That was
That's one of the things we did. You know, the way that we approached it was with that question: where do we start in our newsroom? And so what we did was we conducted a listening tour across the company, and we held a lot of sessions, hour-long sessions, very candid, very casual, involving staff and managers. And we really just opened the floor for people to tell us what they were experiencing, what they had been experiencing, and it was extremely enlightening to hear that so many people had for a while been suffering in silence, and to understand what they had been confronted with, including graphic and sexualized images and some pretty horrible things. And so we talked to hundreds and hundreds of people across the company, and then we had follow-up sessions. We also, for those who weren't willing to come forward publicly, we gave them an opportunity to come and just email us or fill out a form and tell us what they were going through. And then we put everything on the table and really thought, what do we do now? And we started to synthesize everything that we were learning, and we talked to a lot of people in the field, a lot of experts, including Victoria and others, to think about how can we really address this. And it was through those conversations and through a lot of work that we created a committee, an online harassment committee devoted to this. And then really thought about training, like how are we going to train people at the company if they are dealing with this, and what can they do to protect themselves? We also are building a team of people who are at staff level who are going to be able to respond 24/7 if if members of the staff need someone to talk to, and those folks will understand, the people on that committee will understand how to escalate what they're seeing, what they're hearing. And then we're putting all of that work we're creating a database to house that so that we can track this over time and become a little bit more proactive. Like, here are the topics and the issues that are attracting a lot of attention, what can we do? But I think the most important thing that we have learned through our process is just how critically important it is to evangelize what we're doing and to keep the conversation front and center in the newsroom. And I think the more that we do that, the more that people feel comfortable, they're in an environment where they can come forward, and that is really the starting point. So that's what we've done.
That piece about culture is so important, Karen. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I don't know if other folks want to talk a little bit about that, but culture is creating a culture where people feel safe and comfortable telling you that something is wrong is one of the hardest aspects of this problem to solve. But anyway, you guys can jump in whatever capacity you're interested in.
Well, from 2019, after we met, actually, we created a kind of task force in France Télévisions to think about this issue. Human resources, newsroom, security guys, cyber security specifically, social room, specialist of social medias, etc., etc. And we, of course, we began to build a training program, as you did. Actually, it's still on. I have 2 sessions next week, for example. Because, we have newsrooms everywhere in France, 24 local newsrooms in France, 9 in the overseas territories, 2 national newsrooms, so it's huge. And we created a guide, actually very, very close to the strategy proposed by PAN America. every time an online harassment is coming, we decided to create a simultaneous reaction, a global protocol. The journalist can mail the social room, so those social networks specialists, the legal department, the security department, the quality of working life department, we have that in France Télévisions. They are all notified at the same time.
Can I move to France?
Yeah. It's part of the human resources.
Quality of life department.
But seriously, it's something to mental health, of course. So it's a serious department, actually. So they are all notified at the same time, and still at the same time, a trusted third party is immediately designated. I heard about this notion of trusted third party from you, actually. It's very important, to designate beforehand somebody who will be able to take your, if you're harassed, your social account to check the messages and to collect proofs, because it's very important in a legal, as a legal point of view. So we teach that tactic. It's more a tactic than a strategy, actually. Of course, the main message is you're not alone. You're not alone. You are harassed because of your job for France Télévisions. So France Télévisions owes you an assistance. Owes you, it's a duty. So we teach that. It takes time, and at the same time we deal with the cases which are coming, which are quite many. I have to say that we have a good surprise with the French presidential election campaign. We haven't had so many cases of cyber harassment. And maybe it has something to do with the evolution of the laws in France. But I'm not sure about that. It's just a question I asked.
We say don't jinx it, knock on wood. You say it and then it unleashes. But Jason, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, it's heartening to see, right, that three large institutions all kind of meeting at the same point with a cross-functional team that's dedicated to this. Some of the notes from each organization we do as well: rapid response, diverse group that covers many functions. I think I'll be brave and talk about a mistake so that people can understand a little bit of the evolution of our thought process around this work. When we first launched this program, at the times, it was actually just before I arrived, at the times when the program was launched, a journalist could report a threat to the management, and the way that the journalist could report the threat, they felt it was very important. Of course, it needs to be 24/7, right? 24/7, they can send a report. So we did that, right? There was a phone number that you could call, and there was a form you could fill out. And when you went to go fill out the form, it was like applying for a driver's license. So it was like, what's your name? What's your email? What is the harassment? When did it start? Can you send screenshots? Can you include information? On and on and on and on and on. Now, the thinking behind that at the time was, and this goes back to what I said earlier about the concern of the offline harm versus the online. The thinking at the time was, if this threat is actually a credible physical security threat, we need all of this information up front as quick as possible so we can call the police and get them to go. But I think, as everyone knows at this point, 99.999% of these threats are not the kind of threat where you need to call the police and immediately get them. What you need is an immediate response to that journalist that, as Becca says, you're not alone, and there's a human being that's going to respond to you. And so the idea of what we had at the beginning, which is like a form that you fill out, and then you would get an auto bounce back email saying, this email has been received and you will receive a response within blah, blah, blah. I mean, everyone's laughing, being like, how can you be that dumb that you did this? But at the time, just to say that the thinking was really about just an obsession over this physical safety component that, well, we just need to make sure, that you're going to be safe, and if we have to get you to a safe house or bring the police or something. And we know that that's not how most harassment and abuse works. So we scrap that entire system, and it's a very simple system now. And in the back end, it's complex. But the rule that we keep is that if somebody sends a message saying, I'm being harassed, they need to be responded to within 30 minutes.
30 minutes, wow.
Right? So it says, let me be clear, the response doesn't have to say anything other than, got your message, can we set up a time to chat? Or got your message, like a person. So and we have the resources that we have a large enough security team that there could be somebody that can be monitoring this all the time. But you don't have to hold yourself to that specific standard. Rather, what I want to emphasize is that the most important point of it is that there's a human being, not an auto response, a human being. It doesn't have to be in the security team, right? There's this whole network. It can be an editor, it can be an ombudsman, it can be somebody in the human resources department. They just have to respond quickly and say, I'm looking at this. And that is, in most cases, what somebody who's reporting harassment wants to see. And it was a learning that we implemented, maybe 3.5, 4 years ago, and it made our entire process a lot simpler and more effective.
I really appreciate you pointing out something that, because people can learn, we can all learn from mistakes, because there's not intuitive ways to do a lot of this stuff. We're all making it up as we go and trying to do our best. And so I think we can learn from one another. And I think one of the things I hope is that institutions, there's nothing competitive about this problem. Like, everyone is facing this problem. Everyone's trying to figure out what on earth to do. And so I really appreciate when institutions are willing to talk about something they tried that didn't work, and then they made it much better. And so I don't know if anyone else is brave enough to issue the challenge. Is anyone else brave enough to talk about a little bit of trial and error? Or something that's evolving at their institutions, or in Elodie's case, anonymously, things she's seen in other institutions. No?
It's that they didn't hire Victoria early enough to do the, that would be the mistake.
Guys, that was our biggest mistake.
Did I do it right? I'll expect the payment after.
It looks like I've just paid off my whole panel, but I haven't. So I guess maybe I want to talk a little bit about, like, what are some of the key pieces we think have to be in place, right? So there are a couple things we've talked about. We talked about the importance of having, people talk about an internal reporting mechanism. They basically mean, is there some way for a reporter to tell someone in a position of power, authority, or who has some services or resources that they need help, right? That Karen talked about the culture, right? Making people feel like they can be safe enough to come forward and say that they have a problem, and that they won't be punished for it. They won't get fired. They won't get moved to another beat or patronized or talked down to, right? What are some of the other we talked about training, right? We talked about how important it is to give people some basic self-defense training, teach them how to use the internet safely especially now that we're all online in the last 2 years, constantly. What are some of the things I missed that you feel like are critical components to sort of a response strategy?
I think when you have a committee that is focused on listening to the staff, that committee does need to be diverse. Like, people need to really feel comfortable talking to that committee or finding somebody in that committee that they can identify with. I think another key component is that there needs to be training for managers. A lot of people talk to their managers, and there's not a lot of great response sometimes. And I think that was a key part of our program, was really talking to managers and getting them to be empathetic and to listen and to escalate situations when needed. So I think that's another key part.
Yes, and I will just add that online abuse is not only a tech issue, this is a human issue, and there's a lack of, we need a more holistic approach, I would say. And today, when we have discussion within newsrooms, we really need to get everyone around the table. I mean, editors-in-chief, people in charge of social newsrooms for sure, mental health, medical department, well-being departments, and for those who have the chance to get this, yes, and security, and yes, really everyone around the table to define what a protocol could be, then implement the protocol that what I work this way with newsrooms and doing trainings and get feedbacks from the teams. But it's useless for me to organize the trainings without defining the protocol in advance. And I know that this is very basic, but I say that because sometimes newsroom, when a journalist, like a famous journalist, is suddenly really harassed online, suddenly they discover that there is a problem, they want to do something, and they want to do a training. But this is not enough, and we have to define the protocol in advance, then do the training, then get the feedback from the journalists, and update the protocol, I would say. Plus, it's very important that the editor-in-chief is not the only reference for the journalists, because most of the time we're in a profession where we say that we have to get a thick skin, and this is how we are trained. And it's very difficult to go and see your editor-in-chief, especially if you're a freelancer, that you have a problem, because if you have a problem, you become the problem, right? So that's why people feel isolated. And sometimes when I'm saying that they can relate to the editor-in-chief, the problem is that sometimes, most of the time, let's say, the editor-in-chief is a man, is not used to this kind of harassment, because security is always a situation and a person. This is a person who meets a situation, right? And depending on your identity, who you are, your risk assessment is not the same. And this is something that editors-in-chief don't always understand. So they say, oh, this is a regular shitstorm, I would say. We're facing regular bad comments, regular criticism, but this is not this. And they don't do the difference sometimes between regular criticism and old trolls, as described by Jason, and the new synchronized, orchestrated trolling. So this is an important point.
Thank you, Elodie. Well, I want to talk about something that's sometimes a little bit thorny, which is social media policies. Most newsrooms have social media policies. I don't know how many of you have actually stopped to read your institution's social media policies, but most newsrooms have them. The problem is, in my experience, I've read a lot of them. They're often quite vague, extremely prohibitive. They're very focused on, here are all the things you shouldn't do as a reporter in a newsroom that could get you in trouble if you do them, and don't necessarily acknowledge that sometimes you're not doing anything wrong, and people are coming after you, right, because of your identity, because of your profession. And so I guess I want folks to jump in and talk a little bit about what happens when social media policies are kind of actually used to punish reporters instead of empowering them and helping them understand how to navigate the complexity of the internet as a reporter in the 21st century. Who's brave enough to? I will call on one of you if you don't volunteer. So,
well, I think we of course we have a policy about social network behavior for our journalists, and maybe it is, like you say, vague. I don't know, but we are working on a new guide actually these days. But I think as far as online harassment is concerned, we took the problem in another way. We say to our people, the help, the assistance that France Télévisions owes you doesn't depend on the quality of the job you made in your article, in your coverage, or in your on your social media accounts. It has nothing to do. So the same guy, for example, me, can argue with you and say to you, you did a very bad job, but a second later, the same guys will begin to defend you in the protocol I told about before. There is no link between the quality of the job, which has to be judged internally, and the assistance, which is a duty.
thank you so much, Pascal. That's actually super. That's abused for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with their reporting and everything to do with who they are and how they look. So I think that's a really interesting point. Jason, I'm going to turn to you. Those of you who maybe weren't following that, New York Times yesterday I think it was in the Nieman Lab, in Nieman Foundation, so it was very much public, but published new social media sort of strategy and policy, and also a whole set of kind of initiatives around online abuse. So I would love for you to talk about the social media policy and kind of what's different about, maybe you should speak, yeah, like what's different about this approach as of yesterday to what you had before?
Sure, and I want to differentiate between, there's two different, there were two different notes that were released. One is a reassessment of the organization's approach to Twitter, and that's more of an editorial discussion. How it's used editorially, I'll leave that to Dean if you want to bring him up on the next panel. But I can speak definitely to the second point, which is we released a note about how we're essentially we are putting together a more robust defense plan for journalists who are being attacked, and some of the changes, and these are changes that have been worked on for a while and have been talked about even here on this panel. So in some ways it's going to be repeated, but it's focusing on the mental health component of online harassment and calling it out distinctly. It's also, and in fact, the Twitter policy itself also explicitly calls out online abuse on the platforms and how often our staff are abused on these platforms, and it's important to explicitly state that. It shouldn't be considered part of the job, as some have said, was an older way of thinking about this. And then, of course, echoing Karen in the AP, and this is, again, another example of everyone kind of coming to the same conclusion, because it seems like it's the right one. It's calling out the role of the individual manager. And so to zero in on that just for a second, and I'm actually just curious, maybe by a show of hands, if people here, like, who works in a newsroom that has a security team? This is helpful. So two or three. So people. This is good. I have good news for you, and the good news is that the security team is actually not the most important player in this process. The most important player is management. That is what we've learned, right? The security team can help define, of course, on a tactical sense, can do the threat assessments and things like that, and it's obviously very important to have those functions. But really, what underpins this work is institutional and management support of the journalists, and I think that my co-panelists have sort of said the exact same thing. We've come to that conclusion as well. So we regularly have conversations with journalists who say, like, it's great, thanks, security team, love it. I love that you guys are so responsive. I just need to make sure that my manager understands what I'm going through, and that's really the focus of this new policy. You wanted more.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask about it.
Go for it.
But I have it. This is an honest question for the whole panel, and actually for the room, because I'm going to open it up to questions, because I really want to hear from all of you. And then you, in a second, like, you can just stand up and yell the question at me, and I'll repeat it so that for the recording people know what the question was. But one of the things I've come across in the years that I've been doing this work is that there's a lot of different ideas about how newsrooms should approach whether or not a reporter can practice what I call counterspeech, right? So people say don't feed the trolls. Actually, I think it's a distracting way of putting it, and I can explain why. But when I say counterspeech, I mean some way in which you, as a reporter, are defending yourself or protecting yourself or speaking out about what's happening to you, as opposed to being silent about it. And the policy that one thing I found quite striking about the policy that the Times released yesterday is the policy doesn't tell reporters that they can't respond. It doesn't say you cannot respond if you're abused online. But what it says is if you choose to respond, right? So you have a choice. We strongly encourage you not to do so without first consulting with an editor. And so I guess I want to hear from everyone about, like, how do you find a balance between making sure people feel empowered to defend themselves publicly or to speak out if they need to, or they feel that that is actually how they kind of reclaim their power in that situation, but are also not doing things that might inadvertently make them even more at risk, that might put your institution and their colleagues at risk, or just kind of blow up in their faces. So I don't know if, I mean, probably,
I'll
because
speak
I
to it
started
first.
with you, you have
Yeah.
to talk, but I do really want to hear from everyone, because it's not just about the Times. This is a conversation happening in every newsroom I've ever worked
I want
with.
to hear from the others too, actually, because it's, you know, because we're the ones who are out there with the public document. I would say that, first of all, this policy was put together after consultation with many of our reporter colleagues in the newsroom, and the one common theme was that a huge amount of reporters simply are not comfortable on social media and they don't know what to do. And this guidance, it should be clear that this guidance is written, and it's not prescriptive, as Victoria pointed out. We're not saying you are forbidden from. We're saying our experience in the vast majority of cases, for the vast majority of people, trying to counterspeech, trying to fight back against trolling, creates more problems than it solves. But that is not the case. It's not meant to be prescriptive. There are exceptions. There are individuals who are exceptionally good at it. But I've been doing this work for a very long time, and I have a lot of experience. And I would say that far more people think that they are good at it than actually are good at it. And there are so many examples of people who perhaps feel pressured to actually, they think that it's cowardly or it's retreating to not respond. And so they actually feel a pressure to respond, and that ends up extending the cycle and making it worse for them. So I just want to be very clear that this guideline, as it's written, is meant for the hundreds, for the 2,000 journalists that work in our newsroom who have told us that we're just not comfortable. We don't understand Twitter. We don't understand how it works. And we don't know what to do when we're being faced with this. And we're saying, in most cases, the best thing to do is to not respond. However, we do have a team that can help you. And if it's something that's really important to you and you really do, feel like you need to say something, then let's talk it out and talk to some of our experts. And then we can see if there's a way to do that. And I'm just going to say it again. It doesn't explicitly forbid it. It discourages it as a piece of advice based on our experience.
Anybody else? And then
Pascal,
and then we'll do questions. Yeah, 'cause I know we have about 10 minutes left.
A quick jump in. What you said can be summarized in a French perspective to make an attack which is deeply, violently emotional into an intellectual matter. And that is the first job to do, to put a distance and to make the journalist able to think before suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's to be honest, there's just a lot of actually very constructive debate happening kind of internally about is don't feed the trolls still useful advice, and in what contexts and in what ways. And so I would actually, first of all, I open the floor to questions, to thoughts. Please, yeah. I see your hand up, please.
Hello, I write a lot about abusive journalists. I also have the fun of experiencing it a lot. I'm going to argue against myself on the panel just to hear your view on this, because I do sometimes fear that, particularly big institutions, a lot of journalism is done in a bad way and isn't necessarily how we should be doing it, and people should be getting criticised. And sometimes I fear we dismiss a lot of genuine criticism due to the sheer volume on Twitter as nasty, vicious trolling of someone doing their job. So I just wonder whether we sometimes are now overreacting with a very genuine problem by sort of ignoring sincere criticism of our industry.
So the question was for the folks for the recording is sometimes news institutions actually need to hear criticism, and are we conflating genuine criticism with abusive tactics, or perhaps overreacting to some criticism that's genuine that needs to be heard and that institutions need to take in?
I can give a quick point of view for that, and I think it's a great question. I'll zero in on the word institution. Our goal is to be as open as possible as an institution to criticism, but protect individuals. And so part of the project and part of our aims is actually to shift criticism off of individuals and onto the institution. And if people want to attack the New York Times, even if they want to attack the New York Times violently or aggressively, it's far easier for us to handle and adapt to that and be open to that than it is for an individual reporter to have to shoulder the brunt of it. And the last point I'll make to this, which is to explain how this works in practice, we have many reporters who, for example, they'll work on a story that has 5 or 6 bylines, but only one reporter is singled out for criticism, and I should leave you to guess which reporter that's going to be who's singled out for criticism. And so our objective in these cases is to say, well, let's take a step back and let's redirect this criticism towards the institution and see if maybe there's something to be learned here, but not focus on the reporter. And one of the best ways to do that, going back to the manager idea, one of the best ways to do that is to get senior leaders of the company to kind of, that's who should be responding. So if you're saying, like, don't feed the trolls or not feed the trolls, you know, while we're trying to figure out, what I can tell you is it's way better to have the institution, to have somebody else, if it's legitimate criticism, to have the institution stand up for itself and defend its reporting than it is to try and have an individual reporter have to speak on behalf of the whole institution.
Thank you for that, Jason. Does anybody else want to add to that?
I can add a little bit there. I mean, I think in my previous role as fact-check and misinformation editor, you might imagine that I received a lot of email critiquing our work, and that's what I read every email, every message, everything that came in. But I looked at it in 2 ways. I mean, I separated it. Is there something with the work itself that needs to be looked at? And that is where I directed my energy. And you know, and then there were certainly attacks on people, on our reporters, for just having written the story. And so, you know, I think that it becomes kind of easy actually to separate those 2 things. So you know, I just speaking for myself, I think we addressed the critique very responsibly and listened to all of it and had major discussions about our work itself and some of the things that needed to be escalated because they were just attacks on our people for their title or for who they were or for having produced that piece went into a separate category, and we dealt with that differently.
And I really appreciate the question. It was a good one and a good sort of topic for discussion. Does anyone else have questions? Harlow. Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's, you know, the point Arla makes, the question she's asking is, you know, how do you put resources towards this problem? This is not, you don't solve this problem for free, and you don't actually solve the problem at all. You alleviate and you tackle, and you're constantly pushing back and navigating. So I can tackle it. I'm actually quite, I'm coming to institutions to encourage them and help them do this, but I don't have to be the one who deals with their budgets. So I don't know if anyone wants to tackle this question of how do you encourage an institution to spend money on this problem, and then I can, whatever is not filled in, I'll fill in.
In our case, we are a big company. The most expensive was to be affiliated with a permanent psychological service. People who are able 24 hours a day, all year long, to listen to journalists at every time. That's the most expensive. But actually we had that sort of help as far as internal sexual and professional harassment is concerned. So we just have had to adaptate our service, which was still existing. So it wasn't a question of budget, but of course it is for small newsrooms, and it's a huge problem for them. I don't know very much about that. Maybe Elodie does.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that, about sort of how to support much smaller organizations than the New York Times and AP and Télévision France in sort of tackling this?
Yes, of course, some organizations supporting journalists provide some helplines or some funds to get access to psychological help. I feel like since the beginning of the pandemic, there's programs to get psychological supports have been developed for journalists, but there's still a huge lack of of budget for these kind of things. We have, you mentioned the case of France. There's a National Association of Female Journalists. They created their own helpline and to provide psychological support. So sometimes organizations of female journalists also provide this kind of support. But for smaller newsrooms, I know that we are talking about psychological support and very concrete steps, but just yesterday, again, for a digital safety clinic, I talked with a reporter. She's a young female journalist just coming back from, she covered conflict, was harassed online, not even a small newsrooms. And when she talked about the online harassment she faced, receiving pictures every day on her DMs of people killed, she's traumatized, suffering from PTSD. And nobody within her newsroom asked her, how are you? So I would say for the small newsrooms, just maybe start with that, acknowledging the problem, and ask your reporter, and currently reporters covering Ukraine and other conflict, how are you? And I know this is not the answer you were waiting for, but that's a first good step, I think.
It's actually critically important. I mean, Jason alluded to this before, like it's not that you have to have an entire physical security team that's like formerly law enforcement or FBI to be able to address some of this. Actually just treating people like humans and checking in on them and asking them how they're doing and making them feel safe to come forward and tell you if they have a problem is the biggest part of the work, and that part is free. It just takes time and energy. So I think we have time for one more question, and I had seen a hand up in the back. Sure, yeah, please, yeah. Yeah. So the question is, what's the advice for kind of journalists in universities? I mean, what I would say is that I think we really, really, really need to start including digital safety and online abuse kind of defense training and resources in journalism schools. I mean, it's happening, but very slowly and not across the industry, and I think that that's huge. But I would also say that actually media organizations can play a role in this, because so many media organizations have pipeline programs for young reporters, for fellowships, internships, et cetera. And I think that it's really, really important that whatever support and resources institutions are offering to their own staff, they also offer to the youngest reporters who are just coming in, whom we don't want to have leave the profession before they've even gotten started because of the abuse that they're facing. Pascal, did you want to?
Actually, we do. I turned the training, the internal training we created, to a course, and I teach that at Dauphine University in the School of Journalism. But I have to say that I proposed that project to every one of the 14 representative school of journalism we have in France. And in many of the cases, they thought that I wanted to teach for money, that I was one among so many journalists who want to teach for money, and they refused my project. So that means something. But
that will change, Pascal, after this panel, I can tell you.
So folks, I have to, as much as I would like us to keep talking, I think I'm getting signals that we need to wrap up. I really want to thank you all for coming. I know it's like the last day of the session. It's Saturday. People want to be hanging out outside. So I really appreciate that you came and sort of talked to us about this subject. And please, come find us if you have questions or want to talk more. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Victoria.